Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act of 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. On June 25, 1990, James Edward Smith was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. His death, like his life, was marked by a blend of the mundane and the bizarre. The denial of his unusual last wish only added to the mystique surrounding his final moments, cementing his place in the history of infamous last meal requests. John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy, one of the most infamous serial killers in American history, left a chilling legacy marked by his gruesome crimes and eerie final meal request. Known as the Killer Clown, due to his public persona as Pogo the Clown at children's parties, Gacy's life was a disturbing blend of charm and horror. Gacy's criminal activities came to light in the late 1970s. Between 1972 and 1978, he lured young men and boys to his home in Norwood Park, Illinois, under the pretense of offering them work or other favors. Once there, Gacy would overpower his victims, mistreated them, and ultimately murder them. He buried 26 of his victims in the crawl space of his home, while others were discarded in nearby rivers. The sheer scale of his crimes, 33 confirmed murders, shocked the nation. Gacy's double life as a respected community member and a ruthless killer was unraveled in December 1978, when police began investigating the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Peace. This investigation led them to Gacy's home, where they discovered the horrific truth. Gacy was arrested, and during his trial, his sanity was a key issue. However, the overwhelming evidence of his guilt left little doubt in the minds of the jurors. In March 1980, Gacy was convicted of all 33 murders and sentenced to death. His execution was delayed by numerous appeals and procedural issues, but his fate was ultimately sealed. As Gacy's execution date approached, he made a final meal request that was as unnerving as his crimes. He asked for a dozen deep-fried shrimp, a bucket of original recipe KFC chicken, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. The request for KFC was particularly disturbing, as Gacy had once managed 3 KFC restaurants in Waterloo, Iowa, during the 1960s. This connection to his past, where he presented himself as a model citizen and businessman, highlighted the jarring contrast between his public facade and his private monstrosity. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois. His death marked the end of a dark chapter in criminal history, but his crimes and his unsettling final meal request continue to captivate and horrify. Teresa Lewis. Teresa Lewis's case is a notable one, marked by its unusual circumstances and controversial outcome. She gained notoriety not only for her crimes, but also for her final wishes and the ensuing debate surrounding her execution. Teresa Lewis was a woman from Virginia whose life took a tragic turn with her involvement in a heinous crime. In October 2002, Lewis conspired with 2 men, Matthew Schellenberger and Rodney Fuller, to murder her husband, Julian Lewis, and her stepson, Charles Lewis. The motive behind the murders was financial gain, as Lewis stood to benefit from life insurance policies on her husband and stepson. The brutal killings were carried out in cold blood at their home in Pittsylvania County, Virginia. Following the murders, Teresa Lewis was swiftly apprehended and charged with capital murder. In 2003, she pleaded guilty to her role in the crimes and was sentenced to death. Her case sparked significant debate due to her gender. She was one of the few women on death row in Virginia, and her limited intellectual abilities, which raised questions about her culpability and the fairness of the death penalty in cases involving mental limitations. As her execution date approached, Teresa Lewis made a poignant final wish. She requested fried chicken, peas with butter, and Dr. Pepper as her last meal. The simplicity of her request, coupled with the circumstances of her crime and her personal background, added a layer of poignancy to her impending execution. On September 23, 2010, Teresa Lewis was executed by lethal injection at Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia. Her execution drew widespread attention due to her status as a female inmate and the ethical debates surrounding the death penalty, particularly concerning individuals with limited mental capacity. Stephen Anderson. Stephen Wayne Anderson's criminal history began with a series of robberies in the early 1970s, but his most notorious act occurred in 1980. On June 25th of that year, Anderson murdered Elizabeth Lyman, an 81-year-old widow, at her home in San Bernardino, California. Anderson's motive was to steal Lyman's Social Security check, a shocking and brutal crime that shocked the local community. Anderson was apprehended shortly after the murder and later confessed to the crime. In 1981, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. His trial highlighted the brutality of the crime and the impact on the victim's family, which contributed to the jury's decision to impose the death penalty. As Anderson's execution date approached, he made a final wish that raised eyebrows and sparked controversy. His request was for a Bible, which he intended to use during his final moments to read aloud and pray. This request reflected Anderson's spiritual contemplation and preparation for his impending death, contrasting with the violent nature of his crime. However, Anderson's final wish was not granted, as the prison officials cited security concerns regarding items that could be used for non-standard purposes. Despite this denial, Anderson remained focused on his spiritual well-being until his final moments. On January 29, 2002, Stephen Wayne Anderson was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison in California. His execution marked the culmination of over 2 decades of legal proceedings and appeals. Gary Gilmore. Gary Mark Gilmore was born on December 4, 1940, in Waco, Texas. His early life was turbulent, characterized by a troubled family environment and frequent run-ins with the law. By his mid-30s, Gilmore had spent more than half his life in correctional institutions for various crimes, including armed robbery. In 1976, shortly after being released on parole, Gilmore committed 2 brutal murders in Utah. On July 19th, he shot and killed Max Jensen, a gas station attendant, during a robbery in Orem. The following day, he murdered Benny Bushnell, a motel manager in Provo, under similar circumstances. Gilmore's crimes were senseless and brutal, carried out with cold precision and a lack of remorse that shocked the local community. Gilmore was quickly apprehended and confessed to both murders. His trial was swift, and on October 7, 1976, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. What made Gilmore's case extraordinary was his insistence on accepting his sentence and forgoing all appeals, a stance that was highly unusual at the time. As Gilmore's execution date approached, he made a final request that highlighted his acceptance of his fate. He asked for a hamburger, hard-boiled eggs, a baked potato, coffee, and 3 shots of Jack Daniel's whiskey. This meal request, particularly the whiskey, was not granted due to prison regulations. On January 17, 1977, Gary Gilmore was executed by firing squad at the Utah State Prison. His execution was the first in the United States in nearly a decade, following a de facto moratorium on capital punishment. Gilmore's case reignited national debates about the death penalty and its place in the American justice system. Gilmore's final words, "Let's do it," became infamous, symbolizing his defiance and readiness to face the consequences of his actions. His story was later immortalized in Norman Mailer's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Executioner's Psalm, which detailed the complex and often contradictory facets of Gilmore's character and the societal implications of his crimes and punishment. Timothy McVeigh. Timothy James McVeigh was the perpetrator behind the Oklahoma City bombing, a devastating act of terrorism that occurred on April 19, 1995. McVeigh, along with accomplice Terry Nichols, orchestrated the bombing of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, resulting in the deaths of 168 people and injuring over 600 others. The attack was motivated by McVeigh's extreme anti-government beliefs and his desire to retaliate against what he saw as government overreach and the handling of the Waco siege in 1993. Following the bombing, McVeigh was apprehended and quickly linked to the attack through forensic evidence and eyewitness testimonies. In 1997, he was convicted on federal charges of murder, conspiracy, and using a weapon of mass destruction. McVeigh's trial was highly publicized and drew intense scrutiny due to the scale of the devastation and the motivations behind the attack. As McVeigh's execution date approached, he made a surprisingly simple final meal request: 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. This choice stood in stark contrast to the magnitude of his crime, prompting reflection on his state of mind and the banality of his last request in the face of such catastrophic actions. Despite his request, McVeigh's final wish for a stay of execution to allow for further appeals was not granted. On June 11, 2001, Timothy McVeigh was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, His execution marked the first federal execution in the United States since 1963 and brought a measure of closure to the victims' families and the nation at large. McVeigh's case remains a sobering reminder of the potential for violence driven by